The world finds itself once again on edge, and the headlines today reflect nothing less than a profound turning point in global politics. Russia openly challenging Israel's actions. What does this mean? Why now? And more importantly, what are the implications for a world already fractured by economic crisis, wars, and shifting alliances? Let us break it down carefully because the stakes here are far larger than one conflict. They involve the balance of global power itself. Russia's direct challenge to Israel marks a moment of enormous historical weight, and it cannot be overstated just how profound the implications are. For years, Israel has operated in the Middle East with a kind of unquestioned dominance, not because it has unlimited power on its own, but because it has always had the backing of the United States and, by extension, most of the Western Bloc. This support has translated into military aid, diplomatic protection at the United Nations, and access to cutting-edge technologies that gave Israel a strategic edge over its neighbors. But what happens when another major power, particularly Russia, a nuclear state with vast resources and its own global ambitions, steps forward and says, in effect, no, Israel, your actions are not above challenge? This is not just another disagreement on the world stage. It is a disruption of the very framework that has defined Middle Eastern politics for decades. Consider the timing. Russia is still engaged in a grinding conflict in Ukraine, facing some of the harshest sanctions the modern global economy has ever seen. Its financial system is under pressure. Its industries are cut off from Western technologies, and yet instead of retreating inward, Russia is choosing to expand its influence outward in a region already marked by volatility. That should tell us something critical. Moscow is playing a long game. By confronting Israel, Russia positions itself as a defender of those who have felt silenced or marginalized by American-backed policies. It sends a message to Arab nations, to Iran, to global movements sympathetic to the Palestinian cause, that Russia is willing to risk confrontation in order to carve out space for itself as an alternative power. That is not an empty gesture. It is a strategic investment in global credibility. And let's be clear, Russia is not simply raising a hand in protest. The nature of this challenge has real teeth. When Moscow speaks against Israel, it does so with the leverage of arms supplies to the region, with energy deals that nations desperately need, and with its permanent seat on the UN Security Council. Every statement, every warning carries consequences that smaller nations cannot muster. And Israel, used to Western powers closing ranks around it, now faces something entirely new, the potential that its actions could be checked by a rival power that is not only vocal, but capable of materially shifting the balance of power in the region. Here's where the hook comes in. Imagine Israel suddenly forced into a position where its actions are not only scrutinized by NGOs, protest movements, or even the United Nations, but directly countered by Russia's political and military weight. Imagine the ripple effects of that. Would the United States step in more aggressively, doubling down on its support, and risk a direct confrontation with Moscow? Would Europe, already wary from the economic fallout of the Ukraine war, risk deeper entanglement in the Middle East? Or would we see the beginnings of a multipolar checkmate where no single nation, not even the U.S., can guarantee Israel the shield it has relied upon for decades? And what does this mean for the ordinary citizen? Because in every geopolitical clash, the consequences trickle down not just to diplomats or generals, but to everyday lives. A farmer in Egypt watching wheat prices spike because Russia and Ukraine can't export grain. A taxi driver in Tel Aviv paying more for fuel because oil markets panic over instability. A worker in Europe watching heating costs rise because energy supplies are rerouted. When Russia challenges Israel, it is not merely a political act, it is an economic earthquake. The tremors extend to grocery store shelves, to gas stations, to rent prices, and to the sense of stability people cling to. That is why this moment matters far more than a headline. It enters the bloodstream of global daily life. We must also consider the symbolism. For many nations across the global south, Russia's challenge to Israel resonates as a defiance of the Western-led order that has dominated since World War II. These nations see in Russia's actions not necessarily a savior, but at least a counterweight to what they perceive as decades of unilateral Western intervention. This narrative of a challenger willing to stand up to entrenched power has enormous appeal, and it fuels the ideological battlefield as much as the military one. People are watching, not only in Gaza and Tel Aviv, but in Caracas, Johannesburg, New Delhi, and Jakarta, asking themselves whether the old world order is finally beginning to fracture. Here is another hook worth thinking about. If Russia is willing to challenge Israel now, what is next? Does Moscow extend its support more directly to Iran, emboldening Tehran to push harder against Israel's policies? Does it reassert military influence in Syria, using its presence there as a launch point for broader Middle Eastern leverage? Or does it begin to coordinate more tightly with China, aligning its challenge to Israel with Beijing's growing global ambitions? These questions are not academic. They represent the very real uncertainty now hanging over global politics. In the end, Russia's direct challenge is not simply about one conflict or one country. It is about breaking an assumption, the assumption that Israel can act without fearing the pushback of a major world power. That assumption has been shattered, and once shattered, it cannot easily be put back together. This is why the world is shocked, because for the first time in living memory, the rules that Israel and its allies have played by are being rewritten in real time, and the consequences of that rewriting are only beginning to unfold. A shift in global power dynamics is rarely obvious in the moment. It often begins quietly in the background as alliances shift, as economies strain, as wars reveal vulnerabilities, yet sometimes an event breaks through and forces the world to confront what has been slowly building beneath the surface. Russia's challenge to Israel is one such event. It is not only about Israel or even the Middle East. It is about a broader tectonic shift in the global order, one in which American dominance, once taken for granted, is now contested in ways that would have seemed unthinkable just a generation ago. For decades, the United States has shaped the Middle East as a cornerstone of its foreign policy. Israel became a crucial ally, not just militarily, but symbolically, proof that U.S. influence could guarantee security and prosperity in a region known for its volatility. This dominance was underwritten by military bases, energy deals, and vast networks of trade and financial institutions. Yet, as history always reminds us, dominance invites challenge. What we see now is Russia stepping into that vacuum, not as a minor irritant, but as a heavyweight power asserting itself in one of the most strategically important regions on Earth. Why does this matter? Because when Russia openly confronts Israel, it is not only questioning one nation's policies, but undermining the entire architecture of U.S. credibility. Imagine the signal this sends to countries that have long lived under the shadow of Western influence. Nations in Africa, Asia, and Latin America are watching closely, asking themselves if the U.S. cannot guarantee unquestioned support for its closest ally in the Middle East. What does that mean for its promises to us? This erosion of perceived reliability is itself a form of power shift, as damaging as any military defeat. Now, let's add the hook here. Power in the modern world is no longer just about armies and weapons. It is about narratives, legitimacy, and influence. Russia positions itself not merely as a military actor, but as a defender of sovereignty against Western overreach. Whether this image matches reality is another matter, but the perception itself has power. When Russia speaks against Israel, it amplifies voices across the globe that feel silenced or ignored by Western dominance. Suddenly, Moscow is not only a state on the battlefield, it becomes a symbol of defiance, and symbols often move history more than bullets. We also cannot ignore the role of China in this evolving story. Every time Russia takes a bold stance, it opens space for China to maneuver more confidently in global politics. Beijing may not directly confront Israel in the way Moscow does, but it benefits enormously from the weakening of U.S. influence. Consider how coordinated strategies could look. Russia challenges militarily and diplomatically. China leverages its economic might, and together they present an alternative bloc to nations wary of Western rules. What we are witnessing is not just a rivalry, but the emergence of a multipolar system where no single power holds the reins. That shift, once in motion, is almost impossible to reverse. The economic dimension of this cannot be overstated. When global power dynamics change, markets follow, and economies reshape. A weakened U.S. grip on the Middle East means oil producers may feel freer to diversify partnerships, turning toward Moscow and Beijing instead of Washington. This could shift global energy flows, disrupt the dominance of the dollar in trade, and embolden nations to seek financial systems outside U.S. control. The challenge to Israel then becomes a spark for wider systemic realignments, ones that affect how you and I pay for fuel, how governments manage debt, and how nations invest in their futures. And here is another hook. Think of the psychological impact. For nearly 30 years since the fall of the Soviet Union, Americans have grown accustomed to thinking of their country as the unchallenged global leader. For much of the world, U.S. authority was an unavoidable fact, but today every bold move by Russia erodes that sense of inevitability. The very idea that Washington cannot control outcomes in regions it once dominated changes how allies and rivals alike behave. Once doubt creeps in, it spreads quickly, and it is doubt, not bombs, that often dismantles empires. At the same time, we must acknowledge that this shift does not mean instant collapse for U.S. power. Rather, it means the rise of competition. The United States still possesses vast resources, unmatched military capabilities, and deep alliances. But power measured in absolute terms matters less than power measured in relative terms. If Russia and China together can deny Washington the ability to dictate outcomes, then the entire structure of international relations changes. That is why Russia's challenge to Israel resonates so loudly. It is not the act itself, but the broader signal that U.S. dominance can be contested and that contestation can succeed. The deeper question this raises is whether we are entering an age where conflicts no longer remain regional, but serve as proxy arenas for global competition. Ukraine was the first great battlefield of this multipolar world, but the Middle East may well be the second. When Russia challenges Israel, it forces the United States into a dilemma: escalate and risk broader confrontation, or hold back and watch influence erode further. Neither option restores the old order, and both underscore how much the balance has already shifted. What makes this moment so critical is that the shock of it breaks illusions. For decades, policymakers and citizens alike believed U.S. supremacy was permanent, an unshakable foundation of global politics. But no power in history has lasted forever, and today's events reveal that the transition to something new is already underway. Whether that transition leads to greater cooperation or deeper conflict remains uncertain, but one thing is undeniable: the world is no longer living under the shadow of a single superpower. That reality, made clear by Russia's challenge to Israel, will shape every decision, every alliance, and every crisis in the years to come. Every escalation in global conflict carries with it an invisible dimension that often gets lost amid the headlines of military strikes, diplomatic statements, and political confrontations. That dimension is economic, and it is the layer that shapes the lives of billions far more directly than the battlefields ever could. When Russia challenges Israel and the broader tensions in the Middle East deepen, the reverberations go far beyond the military sphere. They ripple across global markets, destabilize currencies, alter trade routes, and transform the cost of living for ordinary people everywhere. This is the hidden story behind the shock, and it is where the true weight of these events can be measured. One of the most immediate consequences is energy. The Middle East has long been the world's energy heartland, and Israel's actions, backed by Western powers, combined with Russia's open challenge, inject new uncertainty into the global oil market. Oil is not just a commodity, it is the bloodstream of the world economy. Every military escalation, every geopolitical standoff sends traders into panic, driving up prices. The result is that consumers in New York, Berlin, or Karachi suddenly pay more at the pump, fuel costs rise, transportation costs climb, and with them the price of everything else, from food deliveries to manufactured goods. And here's the hook: when a tank rolls across Gaza or a missile flies over Tel Aviv, the shock waves can hit the wallet of a worker filling up his car in Los Angeles or a mother buying groceries in Nairobi. That is how interconnected the system has become. But energy is only one part of the puzzle. Conflicts also shake financial markets, and markets thrive on certainty. When Russia challenges Israel, it is not simply a regional headline, it is a message that even more instability could be coming. Investors respond by moving money out of risky assets and into what they perceive as safer havens: gold, U.S. Treasury bonds, or stable currencies. The irony, however, is that this very movement exposes contradictions in the system. On the one hand, America benefits in the short term as capital flows into the dollar. On the other hand, its long-term credibility as the global stabilizer is being eroded by its inability to control these conflicts. That erosion fuels interest in alternatives, and nations begin to question whether they should diversify away from the dollar-dominated system. Each new conflict accelerates that questioning, and once financial confidence begins to waver, history shows us it can unravel far faster than anyone expects. The food supply chain is another critical factor. Russia and Ukraine are two of the largest grain exporters in the world, and the war in Ukraine has already disrupted wheat markets. Now imagine a parallel crisis in the Middle East, one that further threatens shipping lanes or diverts global attention. The result could be sharp increases in food prices with devastating effects on poorer nations that rely on imports. This is not theoretical. We have seen in recent years how food price spikes contribute to unrest, protests, even revolutions. When bread costs double, governments topple. That is why economists pay such close attention to conflicts like this one. They know that an escalation in one part of the world can translate into instability in another that seems, at first glance, entirely unrelated. Let's add another hook here. Think about inflation, already a pressing issue for much of the globe. Central banks are struggling to balance raising interest rates with keeping economies afloat. Now layer onto that the sudden jolt of higher energy and food prices caused by geopolitical tensions. Inflation rises again, squeezing households that were just beginning to recover from earlier crises. Workers demand higher wages to keep up, businesses raise prices to protect profits, and governments face growing unrest from populations that feel abandoned. Suddenly, a confrontation in the Middle East isn't just about diplomacy. It becomes the trigger for economic and social stress across continents. At the heart of this lies a simple truth: wars and conflicts are always paid for by ordinary people. Politicians debate policies, generals move pieces on the chessboard of geopolitics, but the costs are borne by workers through lost jobs, by families through rising bills, by communities through cuts to social programs, as governments divert resources to military spending. Russia's challenge to Israel and the potential for escalation it represents is not an abstract clash of states. It is an event that will be measured in the anxieties of a parent choosing between heating their home or feeding their children, in the frustration of a small business owner watching costs rise while customers spend less, in the despair of nations forced to borrow at higher rates just to secure basic imports. There is also the global inequality angle. When crises hit, the wealthy often find ways to shield themselves, diversifying their assets, moving capital offshore, or profiting from volatility in markets. Meanwhile, the poor are left with no such protections. This creates a widening gap that feeds anger and resentment. Every escalation deepens the sense that the global system is rigged, that wars fought over power and dominance serve the interests of elites while sacrificing the futures of ordinary citizens. And here lies another hook. History shows us that such resentment is not a passive force. It eventually erupts, sometimes in protest, sometimes in revolution, sometimes in political movements that challenge the very system itself. The economic story behind Russia's challenge to Israel, therefore, is not merely a side note. It may, in fact, be the central drama. Military outcomes matter, yes, but the reshaping of global economics will affect far more people and endure far longer. Each crisis chips away at the fragile balance that has kept global capitalism functioning. Each escalation introduces a new layer of instability that governments and markets cannot fully control. And in that instability lies the possibility of profound change, whether toward cooperation or chaos, toward reform or breakdown. That is why the economic ripples of this confrontation deserve our attention, because they remind us that the cost of war is never just counted in casualties. It is counted in the daily struggles of billions who never set foot on the battlefield. The question of whether we are witnessing the beginning of a new Cold War hangs heavy over every development in this crisis. History rarely repeats itself exactly, but patterns re-emerge, and the echoes are difficult to ignore. The original Cold War was not fought through direct battles between the United States and the Soviet Union, but through proxy wars, ideological campaigns, and a constant struggle for influence in regions around the world. What makes Russia's challenge to Israel so significant is that it fits precisely into this pattern, a great power testing the reach of its rival by confronting its closest allies, using moments of regional conflict to measure and expose the limits of American dominance. The hook that must grab our attention here is the symbolic nature of Israel within U.S. foreign policy. For decades, Washington's unwavering support for Israel has been seen as proof of its commitment to allies and its ability to project power in the Middle East. If Russia can undermine or even destabilize that perception, then the signal sent to the world is unmistakable. The U.S. may no longer be the uncontested guarantor of global order. That perception alone is powerful enough to shift alliances. Nations that once felt compelled to align with the United States might now hedge their bets, cultivating ties with Moscow or Beijing to balance their risks. This recalibration is exactly the kind of geopolitical drift that defined the Cold War, when smaller nations sought to maneuver between two superpowers rather than accept domination by one. We must also examine the role of ideology, because Cold Wars are fought not only with weapons, but with ideas. The first Cold War was cast as a struggle between capitalism and communism, between free markets and state control, between democracy and authoritarianism. Today, the lines are more blurred, but the ideological struggle is still very real. Russia and China increasingly present themselves as defenders of sovereignty against Western interventionism, champions of a multipolar world where no single nation dictates the rules. For many in the global South, this message resonates. They see in it an echo of their own histories of colonialism and exploitation, and they are drawn to the promise of alternatives, however imperfect. This ideological battleground is just as critical as the military one, and it ensures that the conflict is not limited to specific borders. It stretches across the globe into universities, media outlets, parliaments, and public discourse. Economically, the Cold War comparison also fits. The original rivalry was marked by arms races, sanctions, and competing economic blocs. What we see now is strikingly similar: the West tightening sanctions on Russia, Russia redirecting its trade toward Asia and Africa, and China offering new systems of finance and trade to bypass U.S. dominance. When Russia challenges Israel, it is not merely testing military strength, it is contributing to the narrative that Western economic power can be resisted, that alternative systems are possible. And here lies another hook worth pausing on. Once alternatives gain legitimacy, even if they are weaker at first, they begin to erode the monopoly of the dominant power. This erosion may take years, but it builds momentum, and momentum has a way of reshaping the world faster than most expect. Perhaps the most telling sign of a new Cold War is the way crises are linked together. Ukraine, Taiwan, Gaza, Syria, Iran, each becomes a node in a larger web of confrontation. Each escalation forces nations to choose, or at least to position themselves carefully. During the original Cold War, conflicts in Vietnam, Cuba, Afghanistan, and Africa were never just local. They were battlefields in a global chess match. Today, the same dynamic is emerging. Russia's challenge to Israel is not simply about Israel. It is a test of U.S. resolve, a signal to China of Moscow's willingness to confront, and an invitation to other nations to join in reshaping the order. The risk, of course, is that proxy conflicts can spiral. History shows us that the Cold War came perilously close to turning hot more than once. Whether in Cuba in 1962 or in Afghanistan in the 1980s, today the dangers are magnified by technology, by cyber warfare, by nuclear arsenals on air, trigger alert, and by the interdependence of global economies. A miscalculation in one region could send shockwaves across continents. This is why the question of a new Cold War is not merely academic. It is a pressing concern for the stability of the entire world. What makes this moment so gripping is the uncertainty. Are we watching isolated confrontations, or are we witnessing the architecture of a new bipolar or multipolar order being built before our eyes? The hooks are everywhere. Russia's boldness, America's dilemma, China's quiet maneuvers, Europe's divisions, the global South's shifting loyalties. Each development feeds into a narrative that feels increasingly familiar, a narrative where great powers do not fight directly, but test each other relentlessly through allies, through economics, and through ideology. The challenge to Israel may be one spark, but sparks have a way of lighting fires, and the fire of a new Cold War may already be smoldering beneath the surface.